Hello, everyone. My name is Raquel with Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. The topic of the event for today is moving the endpoint from VPN to Zero Trust, and today's webcast is sponsored by Oporto. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a couple of housekeeping details. We will be having a Q&A session towards the end of today's event, so please be sure to type any questions you may have in the Q&A box. Additionally, Oporto has provided a couple of links which correspond with today's event, so please take a moment to check those out. And finally, this webcast is being recorded, so if you're interested in rewatching, we will send you a link to your email, and you can rewatch it there. And now I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Nick Valencia, who is a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center MVP, as well as Anthony Owida, who is the CEO at Oporto. So with that, I'll pass the time over to Nick to go ahead and get us started.
Thanks a lot, Raquel. Hey, everybody, thanks for joining me today. You've probably spent the last 18 months trying to get your organization, first and foremost, productive in the wake of everything that happened with the pandemic. And then after that, trying to get them secure. And you're at a point now where you're really trying to find real solutions, trying to figure out what the future is going to look like. How do we address even the state of cyber attacks has changed dramatically over the last 18 months as well. And a lot of you, obviously, just by the fact that you're on today's webcast, are very much interested in things like Zero Trust and how do we get there. And so we're going to spend the bulk of today talking about endpoints specifically, sort of how VPNs play a role in trying to establish security, how do you get to Zero Trust, the combination of the three therein, and what's really the right way to implement this in terms of as you're moving towards Zero Trust, what do you do at the end? It's kind of the question we want to answer. And so I'm joined today by Anthony, and Anthony and I are going to have a bit of a discussion. So first off, Anthony, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Nick.
Yeah, glad you're here. Now, if you've been on one of my webcasts before, you know the format pretty well. If you haven't, here's how it goes. There is no death by PowerPoint. There are 4 slides in addition to the title slide that you're still looking at right now. And this is mostly about a discussion. I want you all to think of the slides as being visual indicators of what we're discussing as opposed to being solely the focus. And because this is sort of a discussion format, I definitely want you to feel you can participate in it. And so I have the Q&A box up here, up and running in front of me. If you have questions, comments, anecdotes, thoughts, something you just want to inject into the conversation, as long as it comes in time that it's contextually appropriate, I'll be certain to ask that question or mention that comment, those kinds of things as best I can. And then, of course, we'll still have some formal Q&A time at the end of today's webcast as well. So if all that makes sense to all of you, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. And the first place I usually like to start, excuse me, is with any topic, is just looking at some industry data to kind of get a sense of what does the industry look like, what's going on, what's of concern, that kind of thing. I do want to mention before I put some stats up here, I do not like FUD. I am not trying to make you scared of something or that kind of thing. I'm just simply trying to figure out what's going on, because I know a lot of you have your heads down on strategic implementations and anything else in the organization besides what's going on inside of industry data. And so I'm trying to consolidate all that here so you get a sense of what is the current state. And so I have 4 stats I'm going to bring up here. The first thing here, this comes from Zscaler's VPN risk report. And you see here that 72% of organizations are actually really prioritizing the idea of getting to Zero Trust somehow. And again, as I mentioned early on, I think that obviously includes all of you because of the fact that you're even just here. And that's what the first part here. So Zero Trust, very important. I'm assuming that most of you have done some things around things like least privilege. We've tried to implement that. And then now you're really trying to figure out how do you get to Zero Trust, which of course is based on the concept of never trust, always verify. And that goes well beyond just like when you authenticate. It's when you have every bit of resource access, validating who you are, where you are, what you're coming from. Is this normal? Is it abnormal? Is it the right time of day of week, system you're on? And the list goes on and on and on. And so you've got almost 3/4 of organizations thinking this is a real priority. Also, you have the use of personal devices by over 2/3, just slightly over 2/3 of organizations have users to some degree utilizing their personal devices. And this comes from Ponymon's Cybersecurity and the Remote Work Error report. And just to corroborate the data, there's another report that came out around the same time from Pulse Secure, and they said 65% of orgs. So it's probably pretty accurate that the fair portion of you have a good amount of your users utilizing personal devices to do something related to work. The next one comes from IBM's work from home study. And I call this insecurity by default because a good, well, it's not quite 2/3, but slightly less than that, 61% of the user base now. So forget about being IT folks. The user base is basically saying, my organization's not doing much to help me secure my personal device. Now, part of that is the fact that maybe you don't have the right solution in place and you can't do it. And there are solutions that exist in the world that help manage even personal devices, which is not our topic today, but it does exist. But at the same time, the org isn't even at least saying, here's our recommendations, or here's some settings, or maybe even having the help desk help lock down a system. I mean, they're not doing much at all. And then at the same point here, VPNs kind of come to the mix over the last 18 months because it was the fastest way to get somebody who is remote to the workplace connected logically to the organization's network. And you can see here, this comes again from Zscaler's VPN risk report, 94% of organizations are using a VPN. And so this is kind of like a current state. We're very, very interested in zero trust. We know that we've got a lot of personal devices. We know that they're very, very, very much insecure, and yet we're letting them connect to the corporate org. Got it? Everyone's got it? Okay, good. So I think where we're going to start here is I'm going to first push out a poll to all of you, and you should be able to see this right there in the On24 interface. And I want to just do this from a standpoint of just trying to understand what you've done in terms of your desktops. Like, are you using VDI or desktop as a service, something along those lines where you're deciding to maybe move away from VPNs? And you can go ahead and answer yes and no, and just again interact with the screen there. And while we're waiting, Anthony, I'm just going to kind of ask you really, what's your expectation based on when you're talking to prospects and how far they've come, and then this concept of maybe zero trust and VPNs and their endpoints and the challenges. Are you expecting most people have implemented some kind of VDI or maybe desktop as a service, or most have not?
Yeah, I think there's two metrics really to answer this. What has happened in the past, and probably we will see if we had the question, which ones are using VDI versus desktop as a service. Probably traditionally, we would see 5 to 10% of the respondents saying we're using VDI. But I think looking into the future, and if we believe Gartner, the vast majority of existing VDI customers and new adopters will be using some kind of desktop as a service. So if I was to take a guess, I would say 10%. Sorry for the long answer to a short question, but 10%.
wait, 10% are or 10% are not? So it's still to be clear.
10% all. 10% all.
Okay. So it looks like about 35% of you have answered. So I'll kind of stall here and keep talking for a moment to see if I can get that up a little higher. And if we can't, it's okay. We appreciate the answers that we can get here. And I guess I'm going to go ahead and I'll close this out here and move over to the responses here. And you can see, actually, Anthony, it's almost like a half and half. Obviously, there's a little bit in favor of no, but it's really kind of half and half. 47.6% said yes, 52.5% said no. So
I was way off.
But,
Sorry,
that's okay. What do you think is attributed to that? I mean, you're dealing with.
I think this particular audience that we're talking to is interested in this topic, probably has some experience with this topic. So I think this is not a sample. This is not it's like if you picked 500 companies in the United States and you ask, what percentage are using VDI or desktop as a service, it would be 10%. But I think the audience we have here today probably reflects that those people are aware, are interested, or are using VDI or desktop as a service. So I think that's probably, how was that for an explanation, Nick?
That's a great explanation. So a little bit of comments came in. Anthony mentions that questions have a third option. Not sure at this time. So that's where Anthony's company is at. Harry mentions still on VPN, but looking to move forward to what's next, which is zero trust. Harry mentions. And then Ralph says, using remote desktop connections, is that considered desktop as a service? Not in the strictest sense of the term. Usually it means using a third-party provider. I'm assuming when you talk about using remote desktop connections, you're doing it yourself. But really still appreciate all of you providing a little bit of context here, because I always like that from the audience. feel free, the rest of you. Comments are always welcome. So, so let's continue on, Anthony. I want to talk a little bit about where VPNs sort of missed the mark a little bit with regard to it being a security measure. And for those in the audience, I think you already know remote, and as it were, and again, it's got kind of air quotes around it, although they're physical quotes, but you get my point. Remote is basically now the perimeter. So it's the coffee shop and someone who's at the airport and someone working from home, and there's a material portion, perhaps, of your organization that is now extending the perimeter well beyond the logical walls of the organization. And the interesting thing here is the VPN, to me, I mentioned this a little early on in the webcast, I think it was one of the simplest choices and probably the right choice for the time, where you're going, holy moly, everybody is going remote. They're all going to work from home. How are we going to get remote, devices, remote endpoints to connect to the corporate network? It's an easy answer. It's a VPN. It's been out for, decades at this point. So I think it's an appropriate choice. But in today's day and age, there is an issue, and this goes back to this stat here, comes from, again, that Zscaler report I mentioned on the last slide, where 94% of organizations, these are cybersecurity professionals, they are aware that the VPN is a target. And I also put at the bottom here a quick bit.ly link that there was an NSA advisory, and that's the bit.ly link, again, case sensitive always, where the NSA said VPNs are being targeted. And that's kind of ties in with the fact that organizations know, just like you should know already, if you haven't already, now you're aware, that VPNs are definitely a target here. And the other thing that I have a problem with VPNs, this might be a little charging to some of you here. I always consider that VPNs are about privacy and not security. They're not a security device. They are a privacy device. They encrypt a channel to make sure that the communications going across said channel remain private. So it's about privacy and not security. And I put here, I know there's authentication. You can put multi-factor beforehand and things like that. You can put security around it, but when you really think about the equation that we're talking about here, things like a personal endpoint or even a not very well managed corporate endpoint, like let's say it's a laptop that is always remote. It's never connected to the corporate network, those kind of things. But then you add in a VPN, it doesn't necessarily equate to a secure perimeter. And so, Anthony, okay, so I have a couple questions I was thinking about as I was writing this slide up, and I'm just thinking about from what you've seen with your prospects, with your customers, from a cybersecurity standpoint, how big an issue do you think it is that you take with organizations just relying on VPNs?
Well, I think there are two major factors that have changed, right? The technology has not changed. I think what has become increasingly problematic is two things. First, in the past, use of VPN was occasional, right? Most everybody worked at the office. Maybe they went home and, they had to check up, something very quickly and they used the VPN. So that's no longer the case. Now, in today's environment, most people are using, a VPN and not spending time at the office. So that's number one. But number two, the bad actors have become much more sophisticated than before. The technology that they have access to, the password spraying that they're able to do, is much more sophisticated than they have been able to do before. So the combination of those two makes it imperative to look beyond VPN. And in a couple of slides, when I'm going to talk to it, we're going to see that the VPN expands the security perimeter enormously beyond what an IT administrator is used to.
It's interesting because we've also seen over the last, it's probably the last 2 years or so. I mean, you and I talked about this a little bit offline. Just a ton of VPN providers having either known vulnerabilities or being a noted victim of an attack. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So 6 vendors, VPN device vendors, have disclosed that they had security exploits in their technology. And in fact, and not just, the smallish vendors, even, top vendors like Palo Alto Networks. And the other part of this is that the Colonial Pipeline, the CEO of the Colonial Pipeline went to Congress and told them that the whole problem stemmed from using a VPN device where it was an earlier version, and a password that was not using multi-factor authentication. So again, probably Colonial Pipeline has been using it for the last 20 years, and it was fine. But in today's environment, it's no longer fine, right? Having a Windows password brute force technology now can overwhelm any Windows authentication. And on top of that, if the VPN device has an exploit in it, then you have a big problem on your hands.
So let's look at the other half of the equation. So the VPN, certainly an issue, and let's talk about the insecurity maybe of the endpoints today. And the question I'm thinking of is, what security struggles are you seeing that your prospects are having with endpoints?
Well, the problem with the endpoint is that it really, if you think about, the corporate work environment before the pandemic, right? You had a physical security around your building. You had, obviously, you looked after the devices. You made sure the operating systems are always up to date. You made sure that they were virus free. And now everybody's working from home and trying to manage devices that are all over the place is a challenge. And if somebody uses on top of that their own personal devices, now you have potentially a security loophole on your network. So the idea that you're going to not only secure now your corporate network, but you're going to secure all those devices, all those physical locations across the network of your users, which could span the country, for any IT administrator, that's a huge challenge. And this is what customers come to us to talk to us about, that securing that environment, securing that perimeter is physically very, very, very challenging.
Sorry, I left myself on mute. And I'd agree on all those fronts. The real challenge is there's so many different types of desktop endpoints that exist, whether it's corporate owned or personal owned, non-standardized methods of security that are implemented. All these things just, kind of, and you can, those of you in the audience that are doing this every day, you obviously can add on to that list.
Yeah,
tons of other things that they are on the problem.
In most organizations you talk to, they probably have Windows PCs that they own. They may have Macs that they own. They may have contractors who use their own devices. They may have help desk that's outsourced to a BP, business process outsourcer. Securing that entire environment is a very difficult task. Very, very difficult task.
I would agree. So let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about Zero Trust itself and why it demands more than a VPN. We could deal with the endpoint maybe on the next slide, I think, more than anything, but let's talk about just from a VPN-centric conversation here. I see the VPN playing a role of simply being a conduit in this case. I mean, it's a secure conduit, it's great, but either end of it isn't necessarily secure, and it doesn't necessarily help with Zero Trust. So there are, if you look at the NIST definition, of course, Forrester is one that sort of started this many years ago, but I tend to use the NIST definition of it, which is, 800-207 or something like that. If I'm wrong, somebody stick that in the comments there. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But there are 5 of the 7 major tenets from NIST's definition of Zero Trust that I think kind of apply here more than anything. And what I want to do is I want to talk about them a little bit and then kind of put over on the right-hand side whether I think that VPNs even help meet Zero Trust needs. And the first one there you see is all communication is secured regardless of network location. Okay, so I think it's safe to go, yes, checkbox. VPN definitely helps. Does it mean checkbox, you have met Zero Trust? Of course, we know that it doesn't. It just it does augment your organization's security stance towards Zero Trust, but it's not going to make you, let's say, quote unquote, compliant with Zero Trust as if it was a compliance mandate. So the next one here, access to individual resources is granted on a per session basis. Well, you think about it this way, yes, there's sort of a per session existence of VPNs because you can establish a VPN session. However, that has nothing to do with giving access to individual resources. As a matter of fact, the VPN might provide some detail around who's coming in and where they're coming in from and so on, but it has no bearing on providing access to individual resources at all. The next one here about access to determining, or access to resources being determined by dynamic policy, again, has nothing to do with using a VPN. Usually it's attribute-based, and it's going to be based off the fact that, like, again, what system you're coming in from, what username are you using, what time of day, what's the IP address you're coming from, what application you're asking for. Do you normally ask for that application? Do you normally ask for that application from that device, from that IP address, at this time of day? I mean, those kinds of very granular sort of checks and balances are in there, are done dynamically to make sure, based on those attributes, line up and say, okay, this not just gives us the right credentials to say that it's the right person, but this connection request also checks all the boxes to say this is normal, this is what we're expecting to see, and the VPN has no bearing in there. The next one down there, enterprise monitoring and measuring the integrity and security posture of all owned and associated assets. This is actually obfuscating in some ways, if you think about it. I mean, it does help put you logically on the corporate network because you're connected to it. But in essence, you're coming in from any of a wide range of IP addresses, and you're made to look like you're on the corporate network itself. And so it doesn't really allow, monitoring all the way down to, let's say, where the user is at their home and that sort of thing. So it's really not helping in that case from Zero Trust. And then the last one here is the organization wants to collect as much information as possible about the current state. And I'm thinking mostly about the word communications. So it's about the current state of assets, network infrastructure, and communications. VPN is obfuscating that because it's encrypting a channel, which obviously logically is outside the organization, but it's still not adding to the, what's the word I want to use, the visibility that's necessary. So I'm just not seeing VPNs really helping the goal here of trying to reach Zero Trust. And so, Anthony, while I sort of appreciate the using of a VPN as a starting point, I think it's kind of evident that it's not exactly, again, I'm doing air quotes here, compliant. There's no compliance mandate for Zero Trust, but if there was, it doesn't help really make an organization compliant with Zero Trust, if you will. Do you see it somehow fitting into Zero Trust at all?
Well, only if you're able to build behind the VPN network, if you're able to build all the granular controls and technologies that are needed to ensure, that nobody can access what they're not supposed to access. In fact, there was a question here from Richard, and it talks specifically about this topic. Really, I think let's all agree on what is Zero Trust. It's not one piece of technology. It's a long journey. It's a journey that takes into account, the usual stuff, right? Technology, people, and processes. But to think that you're going to buy a piece of technology and you're going to be compliant with Zero Trust, that's not the way it works. That's not what's going to happen. So what is really important is to look at your environment and say to yourself, how can I get closer to Zero Trust? By closing those entry points or, by removing some of the threats from my security perimeter. And that enables you to get closer to Zero Trust. In fact, a company like Google, obviously Google is a giant with enormous resources, and it's a very agile company. And it took Google 6 years to go from the beginning of their Zero Trust implementation to the end. It's a very long and complicated process. So I think if anybody's hoping to, buy one piece of technology and implement Zero Trust, they're going to be disappointed. The most likely scenario is that they identify in their environment what are the security perimeters that are most problematic, and let's close those. And I think the VPN right now, based on the statistics you shared, is the source of 70% of the malware and the ransomware that we're seeing out there. So clearly that's a loophole that should be closed as soon as possible.
Yeah, there's a factor that's interesting. The VPN, going back to my first bullet on this slide, the VPN is just simply the conduit. And for those in the audience, you're thinking about, well, where are those gaps need to be closed that you mentioned, Anthony? And it's really, logically speaking, it's sort of like the endpoint environment itself. Because exactly. one of the challenges here is, like I was just on a webcast, we were looking at Solar Marker, which is a dropper that has a banking stealing Trojan. It'll go out and steal your credentials and do keyloggers, that kind of thing. And if someone was to put, let's say, Solar Marker on these endpoints, and the user goes ahead and logs in through the VPN, and I'm going to make an assumption for the moment that there's no MFA in place, just to paint a really awful picture that's horrible. It's just a matter of the keylogger aspect of Solar Marker tracking those keystrokes, and now they've got the ID and password, which of course could change in 90 days or whatnot, those kinds of things. But at least for the immediate time frame, there's no reason why the user can't wait until the system's idle and it's 11 at night, and then connect again through the VPN, and they've got the ID and password, and with a rat install, the root access Trojan, they can go ahead and take over that machine. And I mean, all those kinds of things. You can paint a picture where you just go, the endpoint is the problem, and the VPN is not exactly, it has actually nothing to do with the solution of trying to secure this. You've got to close those gaps here.
I agree. The VPN is part of the problem, as we've heard slightly, like in the Colonial Pipeline. This was the entry point in old device with an old version of the operating system there. But clearly, 75 to 80% of the ransomware and the malware that we're seeing is caused by the end user, either the end user's technology or the end user's behavior.
Agreed. And I did see Richard's question. I want to answer a little differently, if I may, Richard. He's asking about having VDI users specifically, and now they want to do some harm, like maybe they become insiders because their behavior has changed. And I actually want to take it from a broader stroke perspective of just if anyone's behavior has changed. If a threat actor takes over an insider, internal set of credentials and is now obviously acting different with those credentials, or it's an insider threat, in either case, the zero trust principles are saying you need to have a way to determine whether the access that's being requested seems appropriate. And that kind of goes back to if they're doing something they normally do, like an insider, that's kind of tough to tell with most solutions that are or the zero trust solutions that are part of what Forrester kind of calls an extended ecosystem of solutions. And watching those types of activity requests, if they're doing something they normally do, like, hey, I'm going to go into the accounts payable system like I always do, and I'm going to issue a check like I always do, I'm just going to happen to issue it to my girlfriend for $4 million. It's not going to pick that up, right? And even if a bad guy does the exact same thing and changes the banking information so that a check gets sent out to a bad guy-controlled bank account, it's probably not going to pick that up. So it's a totally different kind of discussion here. That's probably more about user behavior analytics or something along those lines, totally out of the scope we're talking about. But at least wanted to make sure that from a zero trust standpoint, where it could get stopped in any of those situations is just watching to see if the request itself lines up with what's normally being done. Like, is this the time of day and day of week they're normally accessing this? Like a threat actor would probably wait until after hours to make that type of activity. And so you'd see that being bad. So there are ways within zero trust that would help in those situations that you're kind of alluding to, but not necessarily, like what you're asking about. How do you see if their behavior is good or bad? That sort of thing. So let's do this, Anthony. Let's talk a little bit about transforming the endpoint. So we talked about VPN a little bit and where it fits into zero trust and where it doesn't fit into zero trust. And let's talk about transforming the endpoint itself. And so I see this as being sort of two parts to an equation around the endpoint. For those of you in the audience here, it's the endpoint itself. It's state of security. How is it being protected? Are there multiple layers on it? How accessible is it? All those kinds of things that have to do just with what the endpoint is, where the endpoint is logically, is it company owned, how secure is it, all those factors, and then how they're connecting to the corporate office. And the VPN kind of fits obviously in that second sub-bullet there. But the how is also things like, do you have maybe certificates on the endpoint itself, or do you have MFA as part of your VPN connection, or something else that adds additional layers of security there, so that if you do want to rely on a VPN, and we're not saying VPNs are bad, Anthony nor I are saying VPNs are bad, it's just you're not going to rely on them as part of your security stance. You're just realizing they're a conduit. It's the things around how they get used that helps define your security stance. Anthony, the problem of getting to zero trust here is more than just VPN. Yes, if you agree,
Oh, for sure, for sure. In fact, there is a question that very much ties into what you're mentioning, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And Raf just said here that we got ransomware via an MSP's tool, not SolarWind. Seems that MSP monitoring would not fit into Zero Trust. And, Raf, that's a very generic statement, but really, the way to think about this problem is, how can I reduce? There's always going to be security exploits in almost anything, right? Microsoft, recently admitted that there was a security exploit tied to AD and printing. So there's going to be security exploits in anything you do. How do you reduce or do you improve your security posture? By reducing your security perimeter. So the idea of having an endpoint that is being used by the end user, that you have to update the operating system to make sure it's patched up, in a timely manner, that you have to update the applications, and we all have done this remote patching and remote updating. We know that's a huge challenge. So the real answer to all of this is, how do you reduce your security perimeter? And then you're able to reduce your security exposure. Sorry, hopefully that answered Raf's question. Did that answer your question, Nick?
No, I think so. I think the idea here is we are really talking about the endpoint more than we're talking about the VPN.
Yes.
But I think that's just the coloring there is that there are some of you that probably thought, no, I've got them coming across the VPN. They're secure. And, no, I mean, no, they're not.
Or that the endpoint is secure, right? I've installed some agent there, and I'm updating the operating system. I'm updating all the applications in a timely manner. And look, Raf just said, well, the MSP's tool infected our environment. So again, there is no single solution, and really the right approach, which is the key tenet of Zero Trust, is to reduce your security perimeter.
No, agreed. And so I want to talk about this from a standpoint of thinking about shifting from, let's say, personally owned devices to something that's far more standardized. And so one example would be whether you've got like a virtual desktops. We heard somebody early on saying they were using remote desktop connections. I think that actually was Ralph as well. Or maybe something like cloud-based desktops, desktop as a service, if you will. Some along those lines. For a couple of reasons. First one being you're eliminating the VPN. In the case of, let's say, cloud-based desktops, desktop as a service, you've got an IPsec tunnel between your logical environment in some DAS provider's environment and your corporate network. And so you're sort of replacing the VPN there as well with an IPsec tunnel. You're also replacing these non-standardized endpoints that are not secure because they're not standardized, and putting them with something that instead is going to have standardized, has the right layers of security, that kind of thing. And then it also you're putting this in an environment. I don't think I have a bullet for this, but the environment that they're working in may have only very specific access, things like access to the endpoint, as an example. Where all you're getting in, let's say maybe even through a CASB solution or a SASE solution or something like that, where you're going to go to the web and then connect over to a virtual desktop somewhere. And that is helping further restrict who can gain access to these endpoints. And that just because a bad guy was able to get a piece of malware installed because a user clicked on a phishing email or something, there might not be that port might not be able to be open that they need to use and things like that. So there's a bit of more security there. And then also just allows for a better ability to manage security because it is a standardized company-owned desktop. Desktop is being done here in air quotes in my office here, as well as getting you closer to least privilege because you do have that manageability, you do have that control over that as well. And so, kind of be thinking of it those ways. And so, Anthony, I'm sort of thinking of this. I mean, admittedly, you're biased on this topic because of cloud-based desktops. This is something that is in your wheelhouse. But what I'm going to ask you to do is maybe in your best vendor-neutral voice, would you paint a picture for the audience of how this kind of environment would be used to replace a current sort of set of endpoints and be far closer to Zero Trust because of doing so?
Yes, for sure. I mean, again, if we talk about all the problematic areas, the endpoint being a problematic area because you have to monitor it, you have to maintain it, you have to update it, you have to patch it. the endpoint becomes an entry point to your entire network. The VPN is an entry point to all your network. If you replace all of that with browser-based virtual desktop, and this is the key point that people do not understand, a browser-based virtual desktop is much more secure than a client-based virtual desktop. A client-based virtual desktop, if you have an infection on the endpoint and you're using a client, the malware can traverse the client and go to your network, and now you have the same problem. But a browser-based virtual desktop is much more secure. To this point, probably on your websites right now, as we speak, there's hundreds and hundreds of users who are visiting your website who probably have malware on their devices, but you don't lose sleep at night because there is no mechanism for that malware to enter your network just because somebody's visiting your website. So this is a very important point. And one of the key points of our value proposition, of anybody's value proposition, is to be able to deliver a virtual desktop in the browser with all the applications that are needed in there. Applications like video conferencing, 3D applications, just about any application would be in there.
And I again love the idea of the fact that at least it's a very different environment. There's an abstraction layer that exists through the idea of the web browser. That analogy you're using of no one's worried about that. That's someone affecting your environment because they're just browsing the web. That abstraction layer of the web helps create that, and that's actually really a very powerful note here. The thing that I also want to point out here is just, and you've said this I think several times, Anthony, and this is the first time I think I've mentioned this here, but in your journey to zero trust, we're only scratching the surface. This webinar is only talking about one little tiny aspect of zero trust. As a matter of fact, Ralph said, should it be called, he's actually making more of a comment, it should be called minimum trust instead of zero trust. I'm actually going to disagree. It should be called minimum access or minimum, but it is truly zero trust, because the way that most solutions that are helping implement this, the default position is you have no access. Versus all of us that have been in IT for many, many years. I've been in it for 28 years, and you just think of something as simple as I create a user account in Active Directory and I add them to the database administrators group, which then gives them access to servers 4, 5, and 6. Just go with the example. And the idea is once I've done that, I kind of wipe my hands clean and I'm done. And the default that we have for Bob and Sally and Tim that are all in the database administrators group is we trust them to go ahead and access servers 4, 5, and 6. That's our default position. And with zero trust and with solutions that are implementing it, which is even farther out of scope of what we're talking about just today, we're just talking about endpoints today, but with zero trust, there are solutions that are going to look at everything that you want. You want to access server 4. Okay, who are you? Well, I'm Bob, and I'm in the database administrators group. Where are you logging in from? If any of you have ever gone traveled to another country outside the United States, I live in the United States, so travel outside the U.S., I'm assuming everyone here is from the U.S., maybe you're not, but you've traveled out of the country and you go to the other country and the passport booth, they look at you, where are you going? Who are you staying with? What's the whole name of the hotel you'll be at? They're asking you all these questions. The default position is, no, you cannot come in this country. But then they ask you questions, and if you satisfy their, whatever it is, their curiosity or their sense of satisfaction for that matter, whatever it is, then they go, all right, fine, stamp, and you can enter. Right? So going back to Ralph's statement of maybe it's minimum trust instead of zero trust, it truly is zero trust in its intent. And it can be in its execution. The trick there is, I think, the policies and the definitions and that you come up with of how you're going to scrutinize somebody defines whether or not it's a minimum trust or truly zero trust. Going back to that analogy of the passport worker person, the security officer, he or she, if they just go, so where are you going? They go to the beach. You go, cool, come on in. Well, yeah, that's definitely minimum trust. It failed entirely, right? But if they're doing that whole looking you over, who you're here with, and you're traveling with anybody, you have any money on you, they start asking all these questions, and they see you start, sweating and shaking, and you start, stuttering and all that. Well, then, you definitely have zero trust because they've done their job. I don't know. I mean, Anthony, anything to add to that? I'm sort of on a rant. Sorry, but
no. Actually, what I want to add to you is that even if by miracle somebody gets to the end of the zero trust journey as defined today, by that time, there'll be new malware, new ransomware, new hackers, new technologies, and there'll be additional tenets to that zero trust, right? So there's no end goal to all of this. It's a moving target. But just like, if you have two countries who are at war, the only thing you can do is to build better weapons than the other person, and this maintains, some level of equilibrium between the two countries.
Agreed. So with that, I know you've got some slides, Anthony. I see there's still a couple of questions that I've sort of waited for to end. They're sort of more general, but I'll wait for those after you've done your slides here. So I'm going to hand the reins to you, and then when you're done, throw it back my way. We'll do a bit of questions. If you guys in the audience still have a question, stick it in the Q&A box, whether it's about anything we've talked about thus far or anything Anthony's about to show. And with that, Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this very engaging presentation. I'm going to try to keep up with you. So we're based in Palo Alto, California. We've been growing very fast. We have 180 customers. And really something we take great pride in is making sure every customer is a reference. So again, we've discussed this ad nauseum today, but really the problem we're trying to solve is that in the past, your security perimeter was the blue oval. And because of the pandemic, your security perimeter today is the red oval. So you have to worry about the physical security of, there are technology right today that are being introduced to the market where, what if somebody happens to be at Starbucks, working from Starbucks, right? We all do that. And, that person is entering, I don't know, some confidential information and somebody sees it behind his back, right? So the environment is very, very different than what it was before. And what an IT administrator is now concerned with is the security perimeter, which includes the physical security of the end user, the security of the endpoint, the security of the app, the VPN. Where is the data stored? Is the data stored on the endpoint? What happens if this endpoint gets stolen? So it is a huge security perimeter, and most IT admins will find it a struggle to be able to secure that perimeter. So the technology we've introduced essentially does a few things, if I was to put it in very layman terms. The first one is to remove the endpoint from the security perimeter. So you don't have to worry anymore whether this employee has updated his operating system, whether the applications have been patched or any of that. Because everything is in a bubble. It is in this virtual desktop that's cloud hosted, and all the applications that you need run inside that virtual desktop. And the only way to access that virtual desktop is through a browser, which makes it much more secure than having to install a client. Because if you have a client to access that virtual desktop, we've seen it in the past where the client can act as an entry point for malware to the servers. And the way we've been able to do that is we've introduced great technologies, compression and decompression, to make sure very demanding applications are able to deliver a great user application. And we also use geo-optimization. Geo-optimization means if you have a company that's spread across the United States, your users do not have to be connected to only one data center, because if they do, for certain types of applications like video conferencing, the data center may be too far away and their user experience is going to be very poor. So we connect users to the closest data center. This is what we call geo-optimization, and this enables your users to use all the applications they need, even video conferencing applications inside the virtual desktop. Sorry, I skipped 2 slides here. The other thing is, obviously, we've talked a lot about it today, is close off the VPN access. And I think what we heard Nick mention, VPN is problematic, not only because the technology itself can be insecure, but also it means that you have to open your network to IP addresses throughout the country and maybe throughout the world to give access to your employees. that is a problem. If in fact you can close off access, shut down all of these IP addresses, nobody can get to your network except for the IPsec tunnel from our cloud, you have reduced your security perimeter hundreds of multiple from before. And in our environment, all activity is done over HTTPS, which is a very secure encryption technology. And we have multiple layers of technology. So for instance, we use a third party, a cyber expert firm that uses automated and expert penetration to make sure our environment is very, very secure. And finally, the third part of this is least privileged access. So in many virtual environments, the complexity is such that maybe the IT set up one virtual desktop that's going to be made available to all employees. Well, that fails the least privilege principle tenet, because if somebody does not need access to the SAP GUI, they should not be able to see it, they should not be able to find it, they should not be able to use it. And we've created technology called desktop variants that allows you, very simply, think of it like a matrix, where you can say, for this group of users, I'm going to turn off, or I'm not going to show this application, this application, this application, and this application, and those users will never see it. They will never have access to it. So again, this helps you deliver on the least privileged access. And the second part of it is that within the virtual desktop that's delivered in the browser, there are features that you can turn on or turn off to make the environment more secure. So one of our customers happens to host the CDC. And as you can imagine, the data there is very highly secure. So for those users in a particular group, they turn off the upload, download capability, they turn off the copy and paste, etc., to make the environment more secure for this specific set of users. Authentication and authorization, obviously very, very important. I think if you listen to today's experts, cybersecurity experts, they do not recommend using AD for security. And you can use AD on the back end, but obviously if it is wrapped with something like ADFS or some kind of SAML with multi-factor authentication, then obviously you have a much, much better environment. And on top of that, if you have the environment where you have group information, you can define what data, what application users have access to and which ones they do not have access to. Nick, any questions we need to jump on?
Let's see, there's a couple that actually have come in here. Actually, someone named Anthony is asking someone named Anthony. So you guys are close. You're not exactly. He says, how cost effective is this solution for a company that has software developers that need many different versions of software and operating systems?
Well, I think what you'll be pleased to know, we cut our teeth in the higher ed market. So we have a lot of universities who are customers, from very large universities like UCLA and others. So we priced our service very attractively to make it, tangible for those type of customers. And we make it very attractively priced even for our corporate customers. And in fact, one of the key things of our pricing is that it's based on a concurrent user pricing. And for that, for some customers that may not make, a huge difference, but for many customers, they say, I have occasional users, and some of my users may spend a couple of hours, so I don't want to be paying for a full desktop for users who may log in a couple of hours a day. So the concurrent user pricing is very attractive to those users.
There's another question here that it looks like Waleed is asking, how is this different from Microsoft Windows virtual desktops?
Yeah, I think that's a really question. So Microsoft Windows Desktop or Windows 365, which was just announced, if you fit in their mold, they may or may not be a solution. Let me tell you what their mold is. If you have less than 300 users, you can only use a virtual desktop that has a Microsoft stack, essentially Office plus Teams. That's all. You cannot have any other applications installed there. That's number one. Now, so that's the business, the standard, I think, offering. Then you have the enterprise offering where if you have more than 300 users, you can define the application you want to have there, but you have to push them out using Microsoft Intune or some equivalent technology. We all have done agent-based updating of the operating system, updating of applications. We all know that's a nightmare. This is the worst thing anybody can be doing. We have a very different approach. You create an image of our base virtual desktop. Think of it as creating a golden image, and you push it out, and you're done. It's a much simpler approach. And from one console, you can manage all the data centers you may be managing across the country or across the world. It's very hard to show you this in today's context, but I would encourage you to follow up, and we'd be happy to show you how it all can be done very, very simply.
Wonderful. So I don't see any other questions in here right now.
I think Richard asked a question. Are you saying you can't control individuals?
Oh, I missed that one. You're right. Go ahead.
Yes, you can control, obviously, individuals or groups. In our world, there's no difference between individuals and groups. Okay.
Apologies. I hadn't scrolled up enough. Truly apologies.
No worries. No worries. Anyway, so for the technically inclined, as you can imagine, this is our cloud. We have a whole stack of technology. But as far as end users are concerned, all they need to do is to log in using some kind of multi-factor authentication and SAML. And then they have access to our resources, which are very highly secured. And if they need access to resources that are on your network, we just have an IPsec tunnel here. And this enables your users to access your network, obviously based on, again, authentication and rules, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very highly secure environment. We've set it up with about 180 customers so far, and we're happy to report that it has been very, very well received.
Excellent. Excellent answer there. I'm going to double check and scroll all the way to the top. Nope, still no more questions. So, Anthony, any final thoughts before we close things out?
No, I mean, honestly, of course, I am biased, so please take what I say with a grain of salt. But I think, if you still have a VPN environment, in your company, I would encourage you to look, very, very closely, very quickly into moving off the VPN environment into something that's more secure. And again, our assertion to you is that the best step you can make today is reduce your security exposure by reducing your security perimeter.
Perfect, perfect. And with that, if you're still typing a question, go ahead and keep typing it because someone from a portal can reach out to you directly and make sure you get the question answered. So don't worry about that. But if there are no further questions, Anthony, thanks for a great discussion today. Thank you for your insight and your input. I really do appreciate you being here.
Nick, I loved your energy, and I think the audience loved your energy because we had 64 calls at the top, 64 attendees at the top of the hour, and we still have 64 people, and we're at the bottom of the hour.
Something like that. I hope so. Everyone in the audience, thank you for your attention. Thank you for sticking with us to the almost bitter end anyways. We're going to give you about 5 minutes back of your day. So really appreciate you being here. Appreciate your comments and your questions as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass things back to Raquel to close us out.
All right. Thanks so much, Anthony and Nick, for being with us today. And just a reminder to the audience, if you haven't already, be sure to check out those 2 resources on the right-hand side of your console provided by Aporto. But other than that, thank you so much for attending today's webcast, which was sponsored by Aporto and presented by Virtualization and Cloud Review. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.